All right, hello, excuse me, and welcome to my channel. We do educational videos here, and we like to focus on great theories of everything, ancient and modern, mostly obscure, and, things like theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, magnum opuses and tour de forces, earth-shattering discoveries, cosmologies, grand unified theories. And we hope to share these, do deep dives into them. If necessary, kind of hold your hand as you go through them, because many of them are quite esoteric and difficult to understand. You might not be wanting to read them otherwise, but if you listen to me, and I kind of try to inject a few things that might help you, then we can get through these difficult texts. And I think ultimately they will be able to help you with your paradigm shifting and your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview, your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health, and sovereignty and freedom. And today is our 9th video that we've done on the book called The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception by B. Agent and Lee. And this is a book about the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in 1947 in Qumran, Palestine, Transjordan, and just before the establishment of Israel as a nation. And these texts were discovered by Bedouin in a bunch of caves there near the Dead Sea. Sweltering heat and desert and the deepest valley in the world, like 130 feet below sea level or something. And all of these looking like Old Testament texts, and some other what they call sectarian material was discovered over the course of years there. And this book kind of goes over the history of getting them from those caves into the public's hands. Many of these documents could be very earth-shattering in terms of what we know about first century Christianity, first century BC Judaism, rabbinical Judaism, or the formation thereof. And but it appears as if some Dominican monks and other mostly Christians got their hands on them as being called the international team to set up a schedule, set up tasks for each one of the members to publish different bodies of texts. So there's one guy who reads and speaks Aramaic, and so he gets kind of the Aramaic text. The Old Testament is primarily in Hebrew, but a little bit of the book of Daniel and maybe some other books are in Aramaic. So he got that. Now John Allegro, we're talking about here, he got a lot of the material from Cave 4, which a lot of it's the sectarian material, like the material from the sect, like that isn't really biblical. It talks about, their discipline, what they, how they go about their day, what they believe in, their social structure of their kind of little monastery that they have there. So we're going to start reading from, I'm not sure what chapter this is, but this is about John Allegro, and he's kind of like the renegade of the international team. He's wanting to put these, to translate this stuff and put it out there right away, and everybody else is like, go slow or don't go at all, because I believe they've discovered some things that kind of contradict their belief systems, and so their belief systems are holding sway over them. Meanwhile, this guy Allegro is he's an agnostic, so he doesn't really have any, anything to kind of hold him back from trying to express the truth in this situation. In the meantime, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the book, it's called the Dead Sea Scrolls, Allegro's popular book on the Qumran material, from which all mention of the copper scroll had been withheld, had appeared in the late summer of 1956, some 5 months after the controversy surrounding his radio broadcasts. The controversy, and especially the letter to the Times, had, as Allegro predicted, ensured the book's success. The first edition of 40,000 copies sold out in 17 days, and Edmund Wilson reviewed it enthusiastically on the BBC. The Dead Sea Scrolls, now in its second edition and 19th printing, continues to be one of the best introductions to the Qumran material. DeVoe did not see it that way and sent Allegro a lengthy critique. In his reply, dated September 16, 1956, Allegro stated that, quote, "You are unable to treat Christianity any more in an objective light. A pity, but understandable in the circumstances," end quote. In the same letter, he draws attention to a text among the scrolls which refers to the Son of God. Quote, "You go on to talk blithely about what the first Jewish Christians thought in Jerusalem, and no one would guess that your only real evidence, if you can call it such, is the New Testament, that body of much worked over traditions whose evidence would not stand for 2 minutes in a court of law. As for Jesus as a Son of God and Messiah, I don't dispute it for a moment. We know now from Qumran that their own Davidic Messiah was reckoned a Son of God, begotten of God. But that doesn't prove the church's fantastic claim for Jesus that he was God himself. There's no contrast in their terminology at all. The contrast is in its interpretation," end quote. After everything had passed, Allegro would have been extremely naive to assume that he could still be accepted by his erstwhile colleagues as a member of their team. Nevertheless, that was precisely what he seems to have done. In the summer of 1957, he returned to Jerusalem and spent July, August, and September working on his material in the scrollery. From his letters of the time, it is clear that he did indeed feel himself part of the team again and had no doubt that all was well. In the autumn, he traveled back to London and arranged with the BBC to make a television program on the scrolls. In October, he returned to Jerusalem with producer and film crew. They immediately went to see Auni Dayani, a Jordanian curator of the Rockefeller Museum and one of Allegro's closest friends. The next morning, Dayani took them round, quote, to get things moving with DeVoe. In a letter of October 31st to Frank Cross, whom he still assumed to be his ally, Allegro described the ensuing events. Quote, "We foregathered and explained what we hoped to do, only to be met with a blank refusal by DeVoe to collaborate in any way. We stared open-mouthed for some time, and then Dayani and the producer started trying to find out what it was all about. The whole thing was a complete knockout, because as far as I was aware, I had left my dear colleagues on the best of terms, or pretty much so. Certainly no bitterness on my side about anything. But DeVoe said that he had called a meeting of his scholars and that they had agreed to have nothing to do with anything I had anything to do with. My pal, the producer, then took the old gent outside and explained in words of one syllable that we were avoiding any controversial matter at all in the program on the religious side. But DeVoe was quite adamant. He said that whereas he could not stop us taking pictures of the monastery at Qumran, he would not allow us in the scrollery or the museum generally. Allegro described himself as still flummoxed. Diani, however, was beginning to get annoyed. He apparently saw the program as a very definite boost for Jordan, antiquities, and tourism, and declared a preparedness to assert his authority. He was, after all, an official representative of the Jordanian government, whom not even DeVoe could afford to defy. Quote, as soon as it became clear to my colleagues that even without them, the program was going forward, they started putting their cards on the table. It was not the program they objected to, only Allegro. They then called in a taxi at our hotel and made the producer an offer. If he would drop Allegro completely and have Struniel as his scriptwriter or Malik, they would collaborate. Then one day, after we had returned from an exhausting day at Qumran, Diani phoned to say that when he had got in it was to find a note, anonymous, waiting for him, offering £150 to him to stop us going to Amman and photographing in the museum there. In the same letter, Allegro tried to persuade Cross to appear in the program. After consulting with DeVoe, Cross refused. By now, the penny had pretty much dropped for Allegro, and he knew precisely where he stood in relation to his former colleagues. On the same day that he wrote to Cross, he had also written to another scholar, a man who was not officially a member of the international team, but had been allowed to work with the scrolls. Allegro repeated the account of his contretemps and then added that he was starting a campaign, very quietly for the moment, to get the scrollery clique broken up and new blood injected, with the idea of getting some of the stuff Malik, Struniel, and Starkey are sitting on, published quickly in provisional form. 2 months later, on December 24th, 1957, he wrote to the same scholar saying that he was worried, quote, from the way the publication of the fragments is being planned, the non-Catholic members of the team are being removed as quickly as possible. In fact, so vast is Malik's, Starkey's, and Struniel's lots of K4 Q material, I believe that they should be split up immediately and new scholars brought in to get the stuff out quickly. A dangerous situation is fast developing where the original idea of an international and interdenominational editing group is being bypassed. All fragments are brought first to DeVoe or Malik, and, as with Cave 11, complete secrecy is kept over what they are till long after they have been studied by this group. End quote. This report is extremely disquieting. Scholars outside the international team have suspected that some form of monitoring and selection was taking place. Here, Allegro confirms these suspicions. One can only wonder what might have happened to any fragment that held doctrines opposed to that of the Church. Allegro then outlined his own plan, part of which involved inviting scholars who can spare 6 months or a year at least to come to Jerusalem and take their place in the team. Quote, I believe that a rule should be laid down that preliminary publications must be made immediately. The document is collected as far as it seems possible, and that a steady stream of these publications should be made in one journal. This business of holding up publication of fragments merely to avoid the deflowering of the final volume seems to me most unscholarly, as is the business of keeping competent scholars away from the fragments. There was perhaps good reason when we were in the first stages of collecting the pieces, but now that most of this work is done, anybody can work over a document and publish it in at least provisional form. end quote. One may not immediately sympathize with Allegro as his personality manifests itself through his letters, cavalier, impudent, cheerfully iconoclastic. But it is impossible not to sympathize with the academic integrity of his position. He may indeed have been egocentric in his conviction that his particular interpretation of the Qumran material was valid and important, but the statements quoted above constitute an appeal on behalf of scholarship itself, an appeal for openness, honesty, accessibility, impartiality. Unlike DeVoe and the international team, Allegro displays no propensity for either secrecy or self-aggrandizement. If he is conspiring, he is conspiring only to make the Dead Sea Scrolls available to the world at large, and quickly enough not to betray his trust reposed in academic research. Such an aspiration can only be regarded as honorable and generous. Allegro's honor and generosity, however, were not to be rewarded or even recognized. The film, completed at the end of 1957, was not transmitted by the BBC until the summer of 1959, and then only in a late-night slot which attracted a minimal audience. By that time, understandably enough, Allegro was beginning to grow uneasy. On January 10th, 1959, after the latest in a long series of postponements, he wrote to Diani, quote, "Well, they've done it again. For the 5th time, the BBC have put off showing that TV program on the scrolls. There can be no reasonable doubt now that DeVoe's cronies in London are using their influence to kill the program as he wished. DeVoe will stop at nothing to control the scrolls material. Somehow or other, he must be removed from his present controlling position. I'm convinced that if something does turn up which affects the Roman Catholic dogma, the world will never see it. DeVoe will scrape the money out of some or other barrel and send the lot to the Vatican to be hidden or destroyed." End quote. After repeating what he'd come increasingly to see as a viable short-term solution, nationalization of the Rockefeller Museum, the scrollery, and the scrolls by the Jordanian government, he reveals the sense of punctilio to which he previously felt subject. Quote, "I might even let out an instance or two when information has been suppressed, but I only do that if DeVoe looks like winning." In 1961, King Hussein of Jordan appointed Allegro honorary advisor on the scrolls to the government of Jordan. The post, however, though prestigious enough, entailed no real authority. It was not until November 1966, 5 years later, that the Jordanian government finally acted on Allegro's suggestion and nationalized the Rockefeller Museum. By then, as we have seen, it was too late. Within the year, the Six-Day War was to erupt, and the museum, the scrollery, and its contents all passed into Israeli hands. And Israel, as we have noticed, was much too in need of international support to risk a head-on confrontation with the Vatican and the Catholic hierarchy. Only 4 years before, Pope John XXIII had officially and doctrinally exculpated the Jews of any responsibility for Jesus' death and excised all vestiges of anti-Semitism from Roman Catholic canon law. No one wished to see this sort of conciliatory work done. By that time, too, Allegro was understandably weary and disillusioned with the world of professional scholarship. For some time, he'd been anxious to leave academia and sustain himself solely as a writer. He was also eager to return to his original chosen field, philology, and had spent some 5 years working on a book which derived from what he regarded as a major philological breakthrough. The result of his efforts appeared in 1970 as The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, the work for which Allegro today is most famous and for which he is almost universally dismissed. The argument in The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross rests on complicated philological premises, which we, like many other commentators, find difficult to accept. That, however, is incidental. Scholars tend all the time to expound their theories based on premises of varying validity, and they are usually, at worst, ignored, not publicly disgraced. What turned The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross into a scandal were Allegro's conclusions about Jesus. In attempting to establish the source of all religious belief and practice, Allegro asserted that Jesus had never existed in historical reality, was merely an image invoked in the psyche under the influence of a hallucinatory drug, psilocybin, the active ingredient in hallucinogenic mushrooms. In effect, he argued, Christianity, like all other religions, stemmed from a species of psychedelic experience, a ritualistic rite de passage promulgated by an orgiastic magic mushroom cult. Taken separately and placed in a different context, Allegro's conclusions would probably not have provoked the storm they did. Certainly, reputable scholars before Allegro had questioned and doubted the existence of an historical Jesus. Some of them, for that matter, still do, though they are in a minority. And there is little dispute today that drugs, psychedelic and of other kinds, were used to at least some extent among the religions, cults, sects, and mystery schools of the ancient Middle East, as indeed they were and continue to be across the world. It is certainly not inconceivable that such substances were known to and perhaps employed by first-century Judaism and early Christianity. One must also remember the climate and atmosphere of the late 1960s. Today, in retrospect, one tends to think in terms of the so-called drug culture, in terms of facile ersatz mysticism, of Ken Casey and his merry pranksters, of Tom Wolfe and the electric Kool-Aid acid test, of hippies thronging the streets of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury, staging love-ins and be-ins in Golden Gate Park. That, however, is only one side of the picture and tends to eclipse the very real excitement and expectations that psychedelia generated even in more sophisticated and disciplined minds. The conviction shared by many scientists, neurologists, biochemists, academicians, psychologists, medical practitioners, philosophers, and artists that humanity was indeed on the verge of some genuine epistemological breakthrough. Books such as Huxley's Doors of Perception enjoyed enormous currency, and not just among the rebellious young. At Harvard, Timothy Leary, with his proclamations of a new religion, still possessed in those days a considerable measure of credibility. In the teachings of Don Juan, Castaneda had produced not just a best-selling book, but also an acclaimed academic dissertation for the University of California. Psychedelic substances were routinely used in both medicine and psychotherapy. Divinity students in Boston conducted a service under the influence of LSD, and most of them said afterwards they had indeed experienced an intensified sense of the sacred, a greater rapprochement to the divine. Even the MP Christopher Mayhew, later Minister of Defense in England, voluntarily appeared stoned on the nation's television screens, beaming beatifically at his interviewer, wearing the seraphically celestial smirk of a man newly promoted to sagehood. One can see why the academic and critical establishment recoiled in alarm from Allegro's book, even though Allegro himself repudiated the mentality of Haight-Ashbury and never himself smoked or drank. All the same, and even if not for reasons usually cited, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross was a distinctly unorthodox book and effectively compromised Allegro's credibility as a scholar. Its reviewer in the Times, for example, became personal, embarking on an amateur psychoanalysis of Allegro in order to debunk him, which, in my opinion, is pretty much good evidence that he's on the right track. Whenever you start with the ad hominem attacks, you don't have anything evidentiary to go at, so you start attacking the person's character instead. Allegro's own publishers publicly apologized for issuing the book, cravenly admitting it to be unnecessarily offensive. In a letter to the Times on May 26, 1970, 14 prominent British scholars repudiated Allegro's conclusions. The signatories included Giza Vermes of Oxford, who concurred with much of Allegro's previous work on the Qumran material, and who was soon to echo his complaints about the international team's delays. The signatories also included Professor Godfrey Driver, Allegro's former mentor, who had formulated a more radical interpretation of the Qumran text than Allegro himself had ever attempted. Allegro continued to bring the attention of the public to the delays in the publication of the scrolls. In 1987, a year before his death, he declared the international team's delays to be, quote, pathetic and inexcusable, and added that his former colleagues for years, quote, have been sitting on the material which is not only of outstanding importance, but also quite the most religiously sensitive. Quote, there is no doubt that the evidence from the scrolls undermines the uniqueness of the Christians as a sect. In fact, we know damn all about the origins of Christianity. However, these documents do lift the curtain. End quote. By this time, the initiative had passed into the hands of the next generation of scholars, and Allegro had left the world of scroll scholarship to pursue his research on the origins of myth and religion. His works subsequent to The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross were moderate enough, but for most readers as well as for the academic establishment, he was to remain an exile, the man who, in the sneering words of the Times, had, quote, traced the source of Christianity to an edible fungus. He died suddenly in 1988, no longer accepted by his colleagues, but still energetic and enthusiastic about his own philological work in progress and optimistic. It must have been some consolation for him to see before his death that his defiance of the international team and his concern about their delays in releasing material were already being echoed by others. In 1956, Edmund Wilson had favorably reviewed Allegro's popular book on the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1969, when he brought out the new edition of his own book, it had swollen to twice its former length. The situation regarding the scrolls was no longer, for Wilson, merely a question of tension and inhibition. It had now begun to assume the proportions of a cover-up and a scandal. Quote, I have been told by a Catholic scholar that at first, in regard to the scrolls, a kind of official policy tended to bias scholarship in the direction of minimizing their importance. End quote. By the mid-1970s, biblical scholars were beginning to speak openly of a scandal. Even the most docile began to have their worries, and the international team were alienating men who had no desire to engage in academic controversy. Among the most prominent names in contemporary Semitic scholarship, for example, is that of Dr. Giza Vermes, who has since 1951 been publishing books and articles on the scrolls. Initially, he had no quarrel with the international team and their work. Like many others, he gradually began to lose patience with the delays in publication. In 1977, he published a book, The Dead Sea Scrolls, Qumran in Perspective, in the first chapter of which he publicly flung down the gauntlet. quote, "On this 30th anniversary of their first coming to light, the world is entitled to ask the authorities responsible for the publication of the Qumran scrolls what they intend to do about this lamentable state of affairs. For unless drastic measures are taken at once, the greatest and most valuable of all Hebrew and Aramaic manuscript discoveries is likely to become the academic scandal par excellence of the 20th century." End quote. True to form, the international team did not deign to take any notice. Nearly a decade later, in 1985, Dr. Vermes again called them to account, this time in the Times Literary Supplement. 8 years ago, I defined this situation as a lamentable state of affairs and warned that it was likely to become the academic scandal par excellence of the 20th century unless drastic measures were taken at once. Regrettably, this has not happened, and the present chief editor of the Fragments has in the meantime gone on the record as one who rejects as unjust and unreasonable any criticism regarding the delay. In the same statement, Dr. Vermes praised Yigael Yadin, who had just died, for the promptitude with which he'd ushered into print the Qumran material in his possession. But it is also a reminder to us all, especially to those who have been tardy in responding to the challenge of their privileged task, that time is running out. And we'll try to do one more paragraph. Time is running out. In his desire to avoid undignified controversy, Dr. Vermes neglected to pursue the matter further. As before, the international team took no notice whatever of his comments. For Dr. Vermes, the situation must be particularly galling. He is a recognized expert in the field. He has published translations of such scrolls as have found their way into the public domain, through Israeli auspices, for example. He is certainly as competent to work on unpublished Qumran material as any member of the international team, and is probably better qualified than most. Yet for the whole of his distinguished academic career, access to that material has been denied to him. He has not even been allowed to see it. Okay, we're going to stop right there and take over tomorrow at this spot. Thanks for tuning in today.